Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you on behalf of Borsika and myself to our webinar. We have a lot to share with you, some new and exciting things to cover in the next 90 minutes. Just one caveat, as you can note from the title slide here, we think that there are some very useful things for you to consider in your next grant or two. We're convinced these will help you with your communication with reviewers and potential users of the information, and we hope, although I have to confess there's not a money-back guarantee, that it could also help your grant review score as well. We have a lot to cover in the next 60 to 90 minutes, so I'll get started here in just a second, but a bit, again, of an overview here. Which says, for those of you that can't read the cartoon, says, first I'll give you an overview of what I will tell you over and over and over again during the entire presentation. We hope ours isn't that bad. We'll try not to put you to sleep. But as you can see on this next slide, we do have a number of things to cover. We tried, as you can see from the asterisk here on items 2 and 9, to both begin and end with some real practical advice and lessons learned regarding implementation science and pragmatic research. We'll be providing some definitions and an example for those of you not familiar with the field, focusing on what some of the key barriers are, share some exciting conclusions from a recent NIH and VA meeting on reporting and measurement issues in dissemination and implementation. And then we'll pause for some comments and questions, and Borsika will take over and talk with you about implementation science. That's what the IS stands for in number 6 there, models and measures, and then we'll conclude with some very specific tips for preparing your grant proposals, and should have plenty of time for your comments then. The field of implementation science is part of the overall much broader knowledge integration exercise in terms of translating research to practice. As you can see in the red highlights the bottom of this slide, we tend to focus on what's known as T3 or T4 research, where there is already some types of an evidence or a guidelines or an indication that a program or policy is going to be effective, and we're concerned in implementation science with moving it forward then, either implementing it in either healthcare or public health systems, and eventually with public health impact. This is a fairly busy slide, but I just wanted to put this up to share with you that there have been a lot of related terms. We'll be glad to take your questions and clarify these, but for now I'd just like to draw your attention to the upper top right-hand side in red there. And for today's purposes, what we mean by implementation and implementation research is it's the study and the utilization of strategies or approaches to either introduce or modify and adapt evidence-based interventions, and I might add guidelines, within the specific settings. So that's the main focus. We're delighted to share with you some of the funding opportunities that have recently been announced. Up until a couple of years ago, this had been something that many people were calling for and many people had pointed out as a gap. But we're, again, really gratified to share with you numerous opportunities here. As you can see, reading down the page on this slide, the NIH has done several recent initiatives. The first one is probably the oldest, but has recently been revised in terms of supporting all the way from small to pretty large grants on implementation science. There's recently been a healthcare systems collaboratory, which you can see the link on there, to fund pragmatic research studies that are done in large healthcare systems and focus on electronic health records. The National Institutes of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases have recently released a series of announcements to support pragmatic research, and as you can see at the bottom of the page, other organizations too, including very, very importantly, the new Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has several announcements, as do other organizations and funders such as the CDC, AHRQ, the Veterans Administration has been a big funder of this, and many increasing number of foundations as well. So I said we're going to get practical and leave you with some take-home messages to start with. So let me hit, I think I have 9 key points here that I'd like to share with you from what we know to this point in this emerging field of implementation science. The first one we hear a lot these days with CTSAs and many others doing community-based participatory research is consider stakeholder perspectives. I think the caveat that implementation science would add is that often there are multiple stakeholders or end users, and sometimes they don't have completely aligned perspectives. So it's important to engage them, not just at the beginning, but an ongoing basis throughout. The second one is one of our mantras in implementation science, and that is that it's never too early to begin planning or designing for dissemination and sustainability. In fact, stated conversely, we have tremendous evidence and consistent experience that if you wait until the end, say of your grant, and then just start talking about what are we going to do for dissemination or sustainability, that's pretty much a prescription for failure. And we recommend you start asking questions early on of the phrase, what are the types of settings in which this type of approach could have a chance of working in the real world. The third point, and you can see context is highlighted in red here, is that multi-level context is really critical. Sometimes we say implementation science is all about context and understanding and assessing, and then when you're reporting your results, sharing context and how it changes over time is a rapidly emerging field and a great need. Turning to the next slide here, implementation science, and I'll have some real concrete examples for you a little later, is about a balance between external validity or a focus on generalization and the settings across the multiple levels of different types of patients, different staff, different settings, and different policy contexts. It is really a critical emerging issue. Number 5, people say sometimes it isn't about the cost, but particularly with the amount of the budget, the national budget going to healthcare, it almost always is about the cost. These issues are central, and we think that there are some concrete and not overwhelming ways that you can practically report key costs, but again, this notion about considering whose perspective of cost are you talking about, as it says in the one quip there on the right-hand side, one person's cost or another's profits. So it's important to talk about what economists call the perspective that's taken. Last point on this slide, when you try to put either guidelines or evidence-based programs or policies into the field, almost every case, what you observe is variation across setting and also adaptations that are done. And rather than either trying to ignore these, as is sometimes done, or suppress them and assume that all adaptations are bad, implementation science has really helped us to realize that there's probably an important level of balance between fidelity to the evidence-based core and appropriate local adaptation. We'll give you some examples of that a little later. The last 3 take-home points that you have here is that many of the issues that we're talking about here are messy, real-world, multi-level issues that are multi-determined, and most interventions have multiple effects, some intended, some unintended. And kind of reporting on the complexity observed and planning for it, for things like that to happen is an important skill. The next to last point is, we like to say, is focused on the science of both the numerator as well as the denominator. The numerator is what traditional science focuses on. That's who ended up participating in a project, and sometimes just who not only began but finished and didn't drop out. But in implementation science, the focus is on the denominator of others who either declined to participate in the first place or dropped out, and understanding, usually through mixed methods approaches, why. And the final conclusion is just kind of a plea or a call for more practical, or pragmatic is a phrase that's being used a lot nowadays, and we'll talk about some particular pragmatic tools, but pragmatic models, methods, and measures that are much more user-friendly and are much more broadly applicable. So we'll turn to the next section that I'm going to cover, and that's on pragmatic research. And in general, pragmatic research is just to focus on more everyday or real-world conditions. And pragmatic approaches have been differentiated from more basic efficacy, or some people use the word explanatory research, which are traditional clinical trials are often done on carefully selected populations under ideal conditions. And again, a pragmatic approach focuses much more on what happens under real-world conditions, and included a quote there from one of my mentors, Larry Green, who has stated that if we want more evidence-based practice, which we all seem to be pushing, then it follows that we also need more practice-based evidence. So, visual way to look at this, many of you might have heard of the infamous 17-year odyssey that it takes on average for a scientific finding to get into practice. I will note there's a little caveat here to this finding by Bayless and Boren that seems to be robust across a number of different areas, and that is that it's actually 17 years, and you can see some of the different stages here that are involved, from initial submission of a grant application to peer review, assuming you get funded the first time, to conducting the study, reporting results, this being picked up in literature reviews, turned into guidelines, and then eventually getting into practice or policy. What people often don't know, though, they have the 17 years, but what they don't often know, as you can see as the background comes in here, is that this research to practice pipeline is for only 14% of the evidence. It's 17 years for the 14% of the evidence that does eventually make it into practice. For the other 84%, almost nothing happens. It just sits there or recycles again, going back to another research grant, and nothing comes out the other end of the pipeline, creating, as you can see on this rather crude graphic here, what you might call more a huge oil spill rather than a pipeline to practice. So the basic idea, as I said before, in a pragmatic trial is a real-world test in a real-world population. I do want to emphasize that being pragmatic does not mean being less rigorous. The focus of the rigor is a little different and kind of crosses internal and external validity, but it's not doing research sloppy or doing poor research. It's a different type of research. On the next slide are 5 key components or characteristics of pragmatic research trials. And I want to call out here particularly the first reference and then references on the next slide or two. This whole field of pragmatic research was given a huge impetus by the Consort work group, who put out reporting criteria for many types of research studies, but they put out some in 2009 for pragmatic trials. And these are kind of the distinguishing characteristics of trials. I've already mentioned a couple of them, so for now what I'd like to do is just focus on the things in red, the third and the last point there. The first one is that the comparison condition in a pragmatic trial is not, as we often do, a no treatment condition or a placebo condition, but it's actually a real-world alternative. Usually studies of pragmatic approaches will do things like studies that vary in either intensity or scope, or maybe a particular theory or method that they're taking, but they're all, by definition, real-world alternatives because they want to be used for real-world decision-making. And the last one is, and one that a lot of people are talking about, but it's a little more challenging to actually do a good job of than give lip service to, is that pragmatic research questions should begin and focus on and include measures that are important to stakeholders, not just to other review groups and things, but to those who are actually going to have to implement or make policy decisions about these issues. So those are the key characteristics. Again, to kind of summarize this notion of pragmatic versus traditional trials, on the left-hand side, the traditional clinical trial, the focus of it is to determine causality with a strong focus on internal validity under highly controlled conditions. As you can see on the right, a PCT or pragmatic trial there is intended to inform real-world practice, clinical, and policy decisions there. And I'll let you read the kind of the contrast there. But again, a much stronger focus on generalizability, applicability, everyday application on the pragmatic trial on the right. I'd like to spend just a moment, and we can come back to this if you'd like, on what I think is a really handy tool. This is again developed by the consort group that's called the PRACES, which is short for Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Indicator Summary. Quite a mouthful, summarized as PRACES. And PRACES has been very useful because it's been used to talk about a study or a body of literature, and what it does is to characterize the study along 10 dimensions. Because what's been found in that, in reality, there's almost never a study that's completely efficacy or explanatory or completely pragmatic, but rather studies vary along a dimension. And this figure on the right-hand side there has 10 spokes going out to it, one makes an X here to show how explanatory, if a study was completely explanatory on a given dimension, like the first one you can see is the eligibility criteria, that would be highly selective, very motivated patients, don't have any other conditions or that sort of thing. Then you might make an X on the arm that goes out for eligibility, close to where the E is, close to 0 or 1. On the other hand, an intervention that was tried to include almost all people that were eligible, had few exclusion criteria, accepted patients with other conditions and complex situations, might be out more towards the periphery there and maybe get 3.5 or a rating 4. Well, after a little experience with this, what you can do is plot a little diagram, or the spoke and hub diagram, that communicates just visually. And again, you can get a real sense for how pragmatic versus explanatory a study is very quickly through looking at this nice little efficient diagram. Our group has used the PRACES criteria in 3 different studies, and just to summarize, given our time constraints, our experiences are first, that this PRACES tool is a very efficient way, we feel, to summarize projects and where they're more or less pragmatic. Second, we feel that the PRACES criteria was a great start to address, and I think very, very helpful for both researchers and potential users of research to understand the study. But we felt that it was a little incomplete, and it didn't address some issues having to do with external validity, in particular things like level of stakeholder engagement, whether it reported, as we said before, costs are certainly often the first question that's asked in the real-world setting, whether resources required or costs were reported on or not. So we felt that there were some other criteria for which we developed a very similar rating scale and diagram. to complement the PRACES criteria. We have found that after a very short period of time, a wide variety of trainers can be reliably coded to use both of these systems, and we're kind of bullish on this here. We don't get any royalties or anything for use of it, but we do really feel that it would help to increase the transparency of reporting and the information value that tools like this were more widely used. So we're switching here. Whenever I give a talk, I'm always asked to say something about the REAIM framework that my colleagues and I developed a little over 10 years ago now. Actually, I guess it's more like 13 years ago now. But how it relates to implementation science and the focus. So I'm going to give you a little bit of overview summary for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and a brief synopsis of how it's been used, and a few hints about where we may be going in the future with the REAIM framework, which is, of course, an acronym that I'll explain to those of you that are not familiar with it. But where it started was that traditional research is really focused on producing the largest possible magnitude of effect, as can be seen there. And often this is a reason why it's conducted under very controlled conditions by expert staff, and that determines its usefulness or its value. Well, REAIM attempts to go a little broader than this, actually much broader than this, and it does focus on effectiveness as one of the dimensions. It's actually the E in the acronym. But in addition, it says that to produce large-scale public benefit or population health impact, we need several other things too that also bring in an external validity perspective. As you can see there, some of these other features are, we want to talk about the program or policy, how broadly can it be adopted in different settings? Does it produce sustains, not just initial effects, but sustained or long-term maintenance? Can it be consistently implemented by a range of staff and in a range of different settings? Very importantly, for health equity issues, can it reach large number of people, the intended audience, and especially those who are at highest risk or most in need? So that's kind of the impetus or the background for REAIM. This slide walks you through what the goals are. And for those of you that have a public health background, I'll kind of walk you down what the REAIM stand for. REACH, again, is focusing on who's participating and who's not participating in a program. Effectiveness means what you generally think it does, and it does refer to effect size, but also the breadth of impact. It looks at what subgroups are benefiting, and also is there a broader, more generalizable improvement in something like quality of life, in addition to just the specific primary outcome. The last three issues there, adoption, implementation, and maintenance, take place at the setting level, or can even be multi-level, where you're talking about a community. Embedded within a community might be a set of organizations, let's say work sites that are taking place, and then within a work site, in the example, there might even be a variety of different staff members or group leaders or something who would give a program. So adoption focuses on the setting and the staff who would be interested and possibly could take on a program. Implementation focuses on how well a program is delivered. Is it done with fidelity to what the evidence-based principles are? And secondly, this is where we report cost in the REAIM framework. And also, very importantly, what types of local adaptations or modifications were made. Finally, maintenance means both what it does intuitively, is can an intervention effect be sustained, but also can it be maintained over time after an initial period of study or funding in the setting? Can the setting sustain it, or can it become institutionalized? I kind of focused on a public health perspective thus far. What I'd like to do now is turn a little bit and give you REAIM now for those of you that might be more basic researchers or from an NIH type perspective, which focuses on personalized, or the new term that's used, in my estimation, sometimes a little prematurely or grandiosely, but precision medicine. But I want to translate REAIM into precision personalized medicine terms here, which again, I won't read all of these, but you can see that these questions are the who, what, why, where, when type questions that some people also refer to as realist or contextual questions here. So we don't want to know just the average effect, but we want to know, as you can see in the second bullet, for whom, for what subgroups is the intervention effective in improving what outcomes, okay, and with what, any or some unanticipated consequences. And again, so this is just drilling down to a level of specificity, and one that we also feel is much more informative and answers the questions that local stakeholders have. So why might this be important? Well, for those of you, just a quick example, for those of you interested in health equity, you know that we have done a lot over the last 10 years. There have been huge improvement in terms of focusing on different subgroups, particularly different minority groups, sometimes different income or SES groups. A lot of work has been done on things like health literacy and sometimes geographic setting like urban-rural. And what we focus on is differences between subgroups. And let's just say for today, I will use a difference for describing the disparity of, let's take urban versus rural individuals. Now, what's highlighted in red is what we usually see in a study, and that is it reports on, for those individuals participating who were from a rural versus an urban setting, or again, high versus low income, was there difference on the main outcome, let's say be it weight loss or blood pressure control? Well, the middle column shows, again, this is hypothetical, but not too far off base. We might have a report that when the usual reporting criteria, which focuses predominantly or solely on effectiveness, shows no differences between those in urban and rural setting, okay? However, that may not be the end of the story, because if you look at the other REAIM dimensions in the left-hand side, and if in fact there are disparities, and for illustrative purposes, I've just posited if there's a 30% disparity at these other levels, what you can see by working down the right-hand column, where essentially you multiply out these disparities, we start with if rural people have trouble accessing the program and are 30% less likely to access it, even though it's equally effective for them, on the right-hand column you can see they only get 70% of the benefit. The rural population does, because they're less likely to participate. Then you can follow this cascade on down, but also if rural settings are less likely, 30% less likely to adopt, then you take off, okay, another 30% of the benefit. You actually multiply this out, but you can see that rural populations are getting less than half of the benefit. And if you work all the way through these intervention REAIM issues, you can end up in a situation where the literature reported, in fact, that they were equally effective, okay, for those who took part, but end up that the overall impact is that rural populations may be receiving less than 1/4 of the benefit. Okay. Hope that wasn't too painful or pedantic for you. Let me just kind of summarize where we're at on REAIM and then share with you some exciting recent information from a couple of key recent meetings. As I said, REAIM has been around for about 13 years now. It has been had variable uptake, particularly it seems like public health professionals, and especially CDC, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the VA have been particular proponents of it. It has been used in over 250 peer-reviewed publications and is one of the more frequently used models for planning and evaluation to NIH grant proposals in this area in implementation science. My colleagues and I developed a website in, let's see, I think 2010 1994, it might have been. It was originally housed at Kansas State University. As you can see, it's had a different number of different homes from different ReAIM colleagues, but we've tried to make this a one-stop shop set of resources, which, in addition to the usual publications and presentations, has a number of tools and calculators and quizzes that are available. And relatively recently, colleagues at the University of North Carolina, you can see on the last line, developed an online training tool as well. So in ReAIM, cost is a critical element. I think two of the things that have changed the most over time, as I reflect back here on it, has been an increasing focus on understanding cost or resources that are necessary, and then secondly, on mixed methods approaches to understand why where there are differences in reach or adoption, to understand what's going on behind that. But to focus on cost for a moment, many people just kind of toss up their hands or kind of have the feeling that, well, if I don't have an additional $500,000, I can't do anything about cost. Costs are also somewhat controversial in some areas of comparative effectiveness research, and some types of settings will not allow formal cost effectiveness to be reported. But my feeling, at least, is, and we can come back to this in discussion, is that certain types of costs are fairly straightforward if you just track them to report, and in particularly what are known as implementation costs, of what it costs to do it in a research study, subtracting out the research cost, but what did it cost to deliver you might talk about delivery cost, and then very importantly, replication cost. What would it cost to do this under different conditions? Let's say if you recruited patients differently, if you had different staff deliver it, what would it cost? Those type of costs, I think, are not that overwhelming to calculate and can be done. But importantly, as it says in the last point there, they do need to be harmonized or done in a standard way, because often when people say they report costs, there are certain things that they tend to leave out. Like, well, what did it cost you to promote the program and make people aware? What about overhead costs that are required there? What about training costs or things like that in times of supervision? So there's a good reference there, and again, I'll be glad to come back to this in our open-ended discussion. Summarizing ReAIM, and moving on to our next multi-point and multifaceted agenda, ReAIM is a framework that we feel can be used for planning studies, for implementation, and evaluation or research review. What I want to leave you with is that each ReAIM dimension provides an opportunity for intervention and to improve public health impact, and most of those have had nowhere near the attention that the effectiveness dimension has been given. I do want to acknowledge that although we have an increasing number of examples of projects that have addressed all 5 ReAIM dimensions within a given study, you don't need to use all of them within a particular study. Just be, again, transparent, one of my favorite words, about which elements that you are using. And again, I refer you to the website and be glad to take other questions that you might have. I really don't have a great deal of time, but focusing on design issues in implementation science, I do want to stress that there are a number of options in addition to traditional both patient level and cluster randomized designs. Implementation science is using a number of natural experiments. As I said before, the Diabetes Institute is funding a number of those. A pretty broadly applicable design is the second one, that's variously known as the stepped wedge or multiple baseline design, where all settings that are participating in an intervention, like all clinics, all communities, get the intervention, but they might get it at different points in time. This works really well where you have a dependent measure that can be tracked and you can kind of have some longitudinal data collection on that. I'll give you an example in a moment of a hybrid design, but folks in the VA in particular, and these designs are summarized in the reference there, is designs that kind of are partially effectiveness designs and partially implementation design. But in general, a lot of these designs focus on trying to help real-world questions, try to focus on producing results a little more rapidly, and in particular, a focus on replication or breadth of application, as well as issues you can see on the last one there, cost effectiveness, feasibility, and sustainability. So here's one quick example of one of these hybrid designs. This is called a hybrid preference design. And the purpose of this study was that actually I was approached by colleagues, diabetes educators, who had a very effective evidence-based program, a group-based program. I think it was 6 sessions, which was doing great. The only problem was, as many things in health education, is they were often given a party and nobody was coming. So despite the fact that they had changed the hours, made it available on weekends after work, had provided babysitting services, a number of things to try and encourage participation, still very few people were coming. They had this great evidence-based program. So they approached us, and their key concern was increasing the reach in re-aim terms, okay? And obviously, while not sacrificing the effectiveness, but they wanted to explore different modalities, and in particular had an opportunity to pair with us and a developer who had a lot of experience making CD-ROMs for medical education. And so what they wanted to do was to study a CD-ROM-based intervention that had the same content as a classroom-based, group-based program did. The caveat, and again, I need to be succinct here, so I can't go into great detail, was that if you use just a traditional randomized design to do this, you wouldn't be able to address their key question, which was about can we enhance the reach? And the reason for that is that a requirement for an RCT is you have to be willing to be assigned to either of the conditions. So, for example, if someone wasn't willing to come to a group program, okay, they wouldn't participate in the study. So what we did was we had a hybrid design where recruiting from a diabetes registry, half of the patients, okay, were randomized to have their choice, as you might do in the real world, where you'd advertise a couple different programs. One that was a CD-ROM-based, mail out, do this at home, another one, the in-person group-based program. And then secondly, as a second step, after within that, they were either randomized in the randomized arm or had their choice of whether it was they wanted the CD-ROM or the class-based program. So long story short, the key result is shown in red there, capital letters, is the CD had slightly over 4 times the reach, 4 times as many patients, so that kind of achieved their key goal. And then very importantly, the second point there, without sacrificing, the CD-ROM proved to be equivalent on the behavioral and the biologic outcomes of diabetes control, as effective as the group program. So for once, study worked out to address this, and as it kind of did in the drawing board. Kind of summarizing my time, and then I'm going to leave you with a figure. As we look back on the history of implementation research, a lot of it has focused on barriers. Why can't something get into the field or be more broadly used or not implemented consistently, which is a frequent problem? It's usually one of 3 things is the answer to that. As you can see here, either features of the research design, and I think we've given you a feel for some of those in talking about pragmatic research. Secondly, it often can be a feature of the program or the intervention itself. Most commonly, it's just that requires such a level of expertise or intensity or training that it isn't practical, particularly in a lot of low-resource settings. Third, and we're starting to have more research on this in terms of like readiness for implementation across settings, some good measures, but features of the particular setting itself that don't work. But most often, we see number 4 in that these barriers result from an interaction. It's not one thing. It's not just the design or just the program or just the setting, but it's a complex interaction or alignment among these things that creates a barrier. And that's kind of shown visually on this next slide here, which has a very long highfalutin title that I'm not going to bother with. But what I want to point out to you is that the things represented in the ovals or the circles, the concentric circles here, are the evidence-based program, okay, which has a number of components on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, the organization, which again has a number of levels, from the staff to the particular settings like clinics to the larger organization, and then finally the research design. The point of this figure is, we also call this the fit figure or alignment, is that it's not a main effect that's important, of like there's just one best evidence-based program or one best organization or one best research design, but what creates success is the relationship, the fit between these, the partnership that's taken between the research team and the delivery setting, and getting a design that's appropriate for the question and practical to use in the setting. So my last general topic that I want to share with you is another visual or schematic. I know you can't read everything here, but the notion is in implementation science, to enhance the value, we want to be thinking from the various early stages of planning, as you can see on the left, through, if you have a pilot phase, to delivering intervention, to when you're reporting on it, and then the long-term outcomes. Because our goals are to get to long-term, as stated there on the right-hand side, the kind of vertical oval, to see an improvement in population health, improvement in health equity, and healthcare system efficiency, kind of the triple aim. This model was created as a result of a recent meeting this fall that Borsika and I were both at, sponsored by the NIH. It was a small invited meeting of experts, and the VA was an important co-sponsor. What it did was identify key issues within each of these different stages that either have been underused, okay, where there are some existing measures, metrics, tools that are practical to you, things like adoption, if you might notice under delivery there, or some cost estimates that are there but underused, and then others with the double asterisk that are shown there, issues such as context on the left-hand side that you might note there, that really that we don't have any good practical measures. So I'll kind of leave you with this to reflect on, but the notion was if we had greater attention to these issues, and again, in a programmatic way that goes across the stages of research. Again, not in every single study, we know this is not practical, but the notion is if this information was thought about, planned for, and reported on in a transparent way, this would really increase the value of research for end users and people that need to make decisions about these programs. So a few take-home points for my section, then I'll be glad to take any brief questions, and Borsika will finish up with you, including some other best stay tuned or wake up if you've been dozing off. We'll finish with some take-home points, particularly for your next grant. In summary, I hope I've tried to make the case for the rationale that there is a pressing need for a different type of research, namely pragmatic and implementation science research that is going to translate more rapidly and be more relevant to the stakeholders. And again, multiple stakeholders, including patients and family, frontline staff that have to deliver a program, and also policy and makers and administrators. Second, whether you use RE-AIM, there are also a large number of other, as Borsika will tell you, other implementation science models. We feel it is helpful to use these models to focus and structure attention through planning, guiding implementation, and evaluation reporting, and all the way up to the point of doing systematic reviews that can help focus efforts on some key issues for translation success. And the final point is that I think that there's also been kind of at the same time an emergence of a number of research networks that are kind of coalitions or collaborations among real-world settings. Foremost among this, I think, are the VA query centers, the practice-based research networks, PBRN, funded by the AHRQ. There are also increasing groups of federally qualified health centers and many, many other programs there that have these real-world centers. These are not just academic ivory tower centers, but real-world research networks and coalitions. So I'll be glad to take any questions that you have, and then Borsika will come up here to take us home.
In my brief presentation, I'm going to describe 4 topics. First, I will discuss implementation science models. Then I will talk about measurement and assessment considerations for implementation science. And then I talk about some tips for grant proposals, and finally a list of resources that researchers could use for further interest in DNI. As it will become obvious when I'm talking about the successful implementation science proposals, thoughtful selection, adaptation, and consistent use of DNI theory or framework is a critical characteristic of a successful application project. When I am talking about models, I refer to theories and frameworks that might inform dissemination and implementation research. So why are these models and frameworks so important? First of all, they can ensure the inclusion of essential DNI strategies. They can enhance the interpretation of study findings, and they can also provide systematic structure for the development, management, and evaluation of interventions and DNI efforts. Fortunately or unfortunately, there are a number of dissemination and implementation models. Rachel Tabak and colleagues, in a recent review of the literature, identified 61 researcher-focused DNI models. We know that there are some additional models that were developed since the conduct of the review, and there are some other models that focus on practitioners and clinicians. When we think about existing dissemination and implementation models, there are different ways of categorizing or identifying them. Rachel Tabak and colleagues identified 4 different criteria. The first one is construct flexibility, that classifies DNI models on the spectrum of broad and operational. Broad models are defined by loosely outlined constructs, and they give more flexibility but also more responsibility to the researchers to define the different constructs and operationalize them. The other end of the spectrum are operational models that have very clear step-by-step actions for the operationalization and provide less responsibility but also less flexibility to the researchers for the putting into practice of the given model. And the models can obviously fall anywhere on the spectrum from 1 to 5. The second criterion is the focus of the model on dissemination and or implementation. Some models will have an exclusive focus on dissemination. Others will be mainly implementation focused, and then you can find models in between. The third criterion is socio-ecological framework level, and which level of that framework might the model be relevant to. So some models will be cross-cutting and be relevant to multiple layers of the socio-ecological framework, and others will be focusing on one layer. And finally, Rachel Tabak and colleagues also looked at whether the models had policy implication. So using these criteria, the models that they identified, the 61 models, were mainly categorized as 3 for construct flexibility, and most of them had an exclusive dissemination focus. Also, most models focused on community and organization, and very few, only 8 of the 61, had policy relevance. Looking at existing applications, funded applications at the NIH on dissemination and implementation research, this is what we find in terms of utilization of different DNI models. This table is based on the review of 46 dissemination and implementation focused R01 applications. And These were funded between 2005 and 2012. As the table indicates, the most frequently used model in these applications was the RIE model, alone or in combination with other models. And there were surprisingly a large number of proposals that didn't mention the use of any theory or framework in their abstracts. Based on the work of myself, Ross, and other colleagues, we had the opportunity to ask questions from researchers and practitioners in terms of their interest in implementation science research. And we found that most of the questions that we received from them are related to guidance regarding the selection and operationalization of D&I models for their proposal or work. So based on this feedback, we thought that it would be important to provide a more systematic guidance, and our team started to work on an interactive website for dissemination and implementation models. Here you see a very early draft of our web tool, which I only show because this is certainly one area where I would appreciate feedback, suggestions, whether in the form of additional models or questions, lessons learned, you might want this website to address. As you can see, working with colleagues, we identified 4 key steps to optimal D&I model use. First, you have to select the model that best fits your question, your research question. It is important to note that there will be not one right model. You can use a certain criteria, the ones I described, the 4 criteria or other approaches to identify a set of models that would work for your area. And often the model that you choose might be one that is familiar for your field or that has been used in the topic area or context where you are working. Ideally, you are not going to create a new model, but try to choose one existing model. There are a number of models, as I indicated earlier, and by using existing models and potentially adapting them, as I will talk about it in the next step, you can accumulate knowledge about existing models, and we can start to be able to compare programs in terms of their model use and construct. Adaptation can be very important in the process of using your models. The degree to which you change your model will be also important. There will be some changes that are easy and can be readily done. We could call them the green light changes. Some wording changes that would make a model or a construct more appropriate for your context might be a green light change. There will be other changes, including modification of the order of the steps in a model that we would call yellow light models or changes that could be done with caution. And then there will be a third group of changes, the red light changes, that might be important to note because they might actually change the very nature of the framework that you are using. And before making these changes, you should reconsider whether you are still using the same model you initially identified. It is also very important not to just name a model in your application, but also fully integrate it. Ideally, your model will guide you in refining the research questions, plan the intervention, evaluate the intervention, and also interpret your findings. Finally, measurement will be also key. As suggested by the work by Rachel Tabak and other colleagues, there are a number of constructs within the D&I models that are out there that will lock sound measures and evaluation approaches. And that really also takes me into the next step of my presentation, measurement and assessment for D&I. Perhaps the most important difference in terms of assessment between traditional efficacy research and implementation science or pragmatic research is the key research question underlying these research endeavors. While efficacy research might be most interested in knowing, does this program, intervention, treatment work, most frequently under optimal conditions, implementation science research asks a more complex contextual question: when, where, how, with whom, under what circumstances, and why does this program, intervention, or treatment work? This question in red is the contextual, or what Canadian colleagues call realist perspective. It is very important in implementation science, and it also defines responses to the key questions of assessment, of what to assess, how frequently, when, and for how long, and with what kind of instruments. These possible answers for implementation science research will be to measure a diverse set of outcomes, including adverse outcomes and costs. Process measures, including mediators and moderators, the measurement at multiple levels and by collecting data from various stakeholders and at multiple time points, and the use of mixed quantitative and qualitative approaches and measures. Finally, Russ talked a lot about the idea of practical measures. This is also a key important aspect of measurement for implementation science. So when we were thinking about, at our meeting that was described on NIH meeting on dissemination and implementation, reporting and measurement, we ended up identifying 5 key challenge areas for measurement in implementation science. The first challenge area is inconsistent terminology for implementation science. Inconsistency and variation in terminology and classification for D&I still exists, and there is a need to map and harmonize the meaning and classification of terms that are being used across different subtopics, subareas, and geographical regions. A second challenging area for measurement and assessment for implementation science is the fact that we are still somewhat unclear about which constructs are of critical importance for implementation science. We do know that there are some areas that seem to surface across different topics. Russ mentioned a few of these. They include context, broad outcome, and process measures, and some implementation process outcomes, and there need to be some more work done in this area. The third challenge is understanding what kind of measures we do have at this time for implementation science. There is a need to catalog, assess, and harmonize existing implementation science measures. There are a number of ongoing efforts to do this. I will talk about 2 of them, the CERT Instrument Review Project and then the GEM D&I Initiative a little bit later. But there are some other efforts that are trying to identify existing measures and identify a subset of them that should be used or advised to be used by colleagues. The fourth challenge is the idea of qualitative information, and that it matters at least as much as quantitative data, especially in implementation science. With mixed methods approaches, there are even harder to use standardized instruments for quantitative data collection, and then also the integration of quantitative and qualitative data needs to happen more readily. There are a number of publications, including one that is listed last on the right column here by Karen Albright and colleagues on the importance of mixed methods in pragmatic trials and dissemination implementation research that I recommend that you read. And then the My Own Health Record Project, an ARC-funded project that was led by Kurt Stange, and then Roy Glasgow was involved with it, developed a context instrument that describes qualitative data collection in the context of pragmatic trials. Finally, the last challenge is the need for practical, feasible, and actionable measures. There needs to be a balance between the code standard criteria and practicality or feasibility, and I will show you one example of how we think about this. Ross already talked about some of these important guiding documents, and the number of publications that were mentioned and could be looked at are listed in the right side for that. So here are some ongoing efforts in terms of measure synthesis and harmonization. The first one is the Seattle Implementation Research Collaborative Instrument Review Project. This project conducted a systematic review of D&I instruments, and they have 3 primary outcomes from this project. The first one will be a comprehensive library of D&I instruments The second one is a rating system that reflects the degree of empirical validation of the instrument. And then they are also planning on developing a battery of instruments that could be used across research groups. To date, they have identified 450 instruments, and they are in the process of rating them. And you can learn more about this project on the link that I provided, but they are getting ready to release the first set of constructs, which are the implementation outcome constructs. The second set of efforts are related to the National Cancer Institute's Grid-Enabled Measures DNI initiative. This approach uses crowdsourcing, which is basically the idea of Amazon and other consumer websites, engages researchers and other stakeholders in identifying and then rating existing measures. The Dissemination and Implementation Initiative has currently 130 implementation science measures across 74 constructs, and they also provided the metadata, so the associated characteristics of these measures, and rating, both in terms of the gold standard rating criteria and also practicality. And you can again visit this website to learn more about this initiative. Here is a screenshot of the CERC work, and then here is the GEM DNI initiative. It can be found under the workspaces section. So I mentioned earlier that there is a need to balance the gold standard measure rating criteria and the practical measure rating criteria. And there are different ways of thinking about it. This is one way that we operationalize this balance in the GEM DNI project. As you can see on the left, in the left column, you can see a set of criteria that should apply to any kind of measures. They are primary research-focused criteria. And the second column, the right column, is the additional criteria that should be used when we are looking at measure quality, especially when the measures are supposed to serve real-world application. As you can see, we highlighted a few of the criteria, and I would like to mention that perhaps sensitivity to change is a criteria that could be in either of the columns. And the other criteria that I will highlight are feasibility, the need for brief, easy to administer measures that have few items. The second one is the importance to practitioners and stakeholders that we are measuring topics and outcomes that will be relevant to their work. The third one is the fact of that the measure has to be actionable, so the information that it provides can yield realistic action by the actual stakeholder. And then the idea of low-cost measure, ideally publicly available measures that can be used across research projects. In this next part of my presentation, I will describe some lessons learned and tips for implementation science grant proposals. First, I'm going to show a few characteristics of strong implementation science research studies. These first two slides are based on the content analysis that was conducted based on the summary statements associated with grant applications to the Trans NIH PARs for dissemination and implementation research in health. The first analysis examines the summary statements of all awarded R01s, R03s, and R21s between 2008 and 2011. And the second analysis looked at the summary statements of triage NCI R01 applications from October 2010 until January 2012. They identified 10 strengths and 2 weaknesses based on the review of these proposals. As you will see, there will be substantial overlap with the topics that Russ and I discussed earlier and the recommendations and findings in these reviews. I would like to point out the second recommendation, the use of mixed methods, since we discussed this earlier, and the topic of sustainability. And finally, feasibility and generalizability, which is concerned with the real-world applicability of an implementation study. On the next slide, we also can see the call for community collaboration, stakeholder engagement. and the use of a conceptual framework, and the potential to advance methods for dissemination and implementation, which might be operationalized by using some of the practical, pragmatic design approaches that Ross mentioned, and or the development of new innovative ways of measuring dissemination and implementation progress, including instrument development and testing. The two weaknesses that they identified from triage summary statement identified the lack of clarity in terms of the significance, aims, and relevance to the VNI field. But the second one is, again, about the use of frameworks, theoretical background, and conceptual models, and how clearly they were articulated throughout the model. So it refers back to this idea of integration of models into the proposal. We see a substantial amount of overlap with these strengths and weaknesses and the recommendations or 10 key ingredients that were identified by Proctor and colleagues. Again, I'm just going to highlight a few areas. The need for clear evidence base, which might be defined differently across different disciplines and topic areas. The need for clear conceptual framework, theory, and model. The engagement of stakeholders, and the use of implementation strategies. And from the second slide, the need for feasibility in the real world setting and a description of that, and measurement and analysis, especially a clear measurement plan for the measurement of the different components and the key linkage of the measurement plan with the theory and framework that was used. Finally, as an overarching note, truly what will drive the application, and this is based on 32,000 scored applications that were submitted in 2010 to NIH, and looking at which criterion had the most impact on the success of the application, approach seems to be the most important. And so that should be made into the heart or the core of the application and described most. Finally, I'm going to talk about a few resources that you might find useful in your work. Here we listed a number of websites, including training websites and resource websites. The one that I would like to highlight is Win Norton's Implementation Network monthly e-newsletter that provides all the most recent publications, funding announcements, learning opportunities, training opportunities in this area, and job opportunities as well. Also the RIAM website that Ross mentioned multiple times, local resources, the PRISP website, and the Make Research Matter website that is a planning tool. And there is a new portal by UNC, which is around dissemination implementation science. So to summarize my presentation, there are many implementation science models. There will be no one right model for your work. You will need to match your research question and the model that you are using. Adaptation of the model might be necessary, and you will want to make sure that you fully integrate the models in your work. There is an important need and gap for the development for practical measures. We need to know about existing measures and assess their quality, so we need information about metadata. And we need to develop measures and assessment approaches for certain key areas, and context might be one that you all remember from this presentation. Some of the key lessons learned and tips from recent and past implementation science grantees are available, and they can be used to guide your work as you are writing your application or developing plans. And there are an array of resources, both local, national, and international, that you can use to learn more about dissemination and implementation science. So this is this last slide where we wanted to emphasize that we do want to learn from you. We want to get your inputs, reactions as lessons learned. Two immediate areas where we would love your feedback are the understanding of DNI models or implementation science models, and what would you like to see on the newly developed interactive website, Are there certain models that you know that are not listed currently in the Rachel Tabak article? Are there certain lessons that you learned or you would want to learn about? The second one is regarding measures. There is an effort currently as a follow-up to the NIH GNI meeting where we are trying to identify systematic or non-systematic synthesis of existing dissemination and implementation or IS measures and the resources that provide a synthesis or a listing of those measures. So if you are aware of any inventory of DNI measures and assessment approaches, please contact me and send me those. And we are going to open this up for questions, and we would really love to hear all the details and thoughts that you have based on our presentation. Thank you for your attention.